This is from Hebrews 11. We're going to be looking at chapter 11 again, but a little bit farther along. And there is a verse when you get down to verse 34, the world was not worthy of them, talking about people who had been martyred for their faith. It's just such a powerful statement that the world was not worthy of them. Wouldn't that be something if God were to look at you or at me and just say, the world was not worthy of him or her? I mean, it's an incredible thought. Well, that's what happens here in Hebrews 11. As we look at it, the writer is really bringing more witnesses in. Hebrews was written, we've talked about this before, to Jews who were going through a time of real suffering. They had given up, their worship in traditional Judaism. They had lost houses, they had lost jobs, they had lost family relationships. Even back then, they were treated, having trusted Christ, as if they were dead to their family. And it had cost them a lot. And now, this was probably written in the late 60s. My guess is it was around 66, maybe early 67. And as we go through, you'll see why I think that. I believe, well, actually, I'll tell you right now, in 67 AD, a great persecution of Christians broke out, and it was a major change. The Christians had been viewed as a sect of Judaism and therefore protected under the Roman law. That was considered a legal religion. When the Romans went in and they conquered an area, they froze things in place with regards to religions. Any religion that already existed, that's fine. They would be able to continue on. People continue to worship as they had before. However, anyone that was starting a new religion, that was forbidden. No new religions. So they had legal religions, religio licita, and illegal religions, religio illicita, illicit religions. Okay, and so the change point came right there around 67 AD, maybe a little bit before that, where Christianity was being viewed as an illegal religion. You remember that Paul, as he traveled, was protected by the Roman soldiers. He was a citizen, and he was protected by them. That all changed. Paul ultimately was martyred, as you know. In fact, he was martyred by Nero, who was the emperor in 67 AD and for a few years following. Okay, and so the Jews knew their history well. And they had this struggle going on in their lives. Following Jesus had cost them everything, and they were being enticed to give up and go back to this legalistic form of Judaism. And the message was, don't give up, don't go back. Stick with it. Keep going. You're near the finish line. Just keep moving forward. Don't change. And of course, the book begins by talking about the superiority of Jesus. And chapter after chapter is about how Jesus is better. He is better than the angels. He's better than Moses. He's better than the prophets, and so on. Better than the law. Now, the writer, who we don't know for sure, but I suspect was Paul, has taught, he has cajoled, he's warned them, and now he gets to Hebrews 11, and he uses one of the very best techniques to prove the truth, and that is witnesses. The example of men and women from Jewish history who did not give up, witnesses to the faithfulness of God. And so you read in Hebrews 11:32 through the first half of verse 35, what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of the lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Okay, so when we look at this section and mention 6 men, they're not listed in chronological order, but they were all rulers of one kind or another. None are praised for their leadership. Each is praised for his faith. So think about Gideon. He assembled 32,000 men to fight the Midianites and the Amalekites. And at God's command, he cut that down to 10,000. And then God said, you still have too many. And so he sent them all to a spring, and they were there to really have an interview. And it was a very public interview. And the determination of who would fight was based on that interview. Okay, and the basic choice that was made based upon how the men drank water. That was it. Okay, so what you see is it's not an interview at all. It's really just, it seems almost random. But that was God's way of cutting it down from 32,000 to 10,000 to 300. Okay, now they're going up to an army that was tens of thousands, and perhaps even 100,000. The enemy, in contrast, okay, and you look at Judges 7:12, is described as numerous as locusts, camels without number, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Just, you couldn't count. There are just so many of them. And now Gideon, of course, had some really great weapons. He had trumpets, and he had pitchers with torches inside. Okay, and so you see the echoes of the Battle of Jericho. But they had fewer men than at Jericho, and where there may have been a significant percentage of 1,000,000 who marched around the city. So they had fewer men, 300, and yet with less effort than at Jericho, the entire heathen army was routed. Man's way is build up, strengthen, plan carefully for the engagement, devise your perfect strategy, count the odds, then plunge into battle. God's way is take away every possibility of surprise, remove your strongest men, guarantee the defeat in human terms, and then you will get the victory because God will get the glory. You know, we saw that in the American Revolution and on multiple occasions. Perhaps the most significant and best known was the Battle of Long Island, when George Washington and all of his troops, virtually all of his troops, were trapped there. And with the East River behind them and General Howe's army in front of them, they had nowhere to go. Howe, for some reason, stopped before destroying them all in the afternoon and waited till the next day. Well, in the meantime, a series of miracles happened, and Washington and his army were able to cross the East River and escape. The revolution would have been over before it had even begun, except for a miracle of God. And when they gathered some years later and formed this new government, they spoke about the fact that it was the providence of God, mostly through the weather, but other means as well, interposing for them on their behalf. And so they won, and they knew it was God who had given them the victory. Well, God certainly gave Gideon the victory. Each man who's mentioned here on the screen before you in Hebrews 11 really gets the victory in the same way. It's the same pattern. Barak is mentioned in Judges 4 and 5. The great enemy of the Israelites at that time was Jabin, the Canaanite king, whose commander Sisera had a huge army with 900 iron chariots, not wooden chariots, iron chariots. Israel had no chariots. So you had foot soldiers going against these chariots, very much like fighting a tank with your bare hands. Through Deborah, God informed Barak that only men from 2 tribes would be allowed to fight Sisera. Okay, so he's cutting it back. He's making it clear that the odds are stacked against you. The tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun were able to fight. Then Barak went up onto Mount Tabor with his band, and he took the offensive, and he charged Sisera. And in Judges 4:15, we read, "The Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and his army with the edge of the sword before Barak." Now, Samson was most remembered for his physical strength, but we're told specifically that it was the Spirit of the Lord that gave him strength. Time after time, he would have amazing one-man battles with hordes of the Philistines. And you read about that in Judges in chapters 13 through 16. God had promised his power, and Samson trusted God for that power. He fought Philistines not in the courage of his own physical prowess, but in faith. Now, isn't it interesting that God also, through Delilah, wound up taking away his strength? And yet, ultimately, Samson wins. Now, he dies in the process. Jephthah is the judge just before Samuel. He subdued the Ammonites. David stands out as very definitely one of the greatest men of the Old Testament, really one of the greatest men of all time. David versus Goliath. You see someone who is incredibly weak, who does not have the armor, who is young, who is small, who is no match for this man that he's going to be fighting. But notice David versus Goliath. It's the same as as when we read about Gideon versus the Amalekites and the Canaanites. Okay, it's all the same. It's very weak people without the capability to win, being given the ability to win by God. In fact, their strength is made complete, is made perfect, is made mature, is made full in their weakness. The rest of Israel was cowering in fear. David calmly walked up to Goliath and said in 1 Samuel 17:46, "This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you." Samuel added to this list of words. He's added to it. His great foes were his own people with their idolatry and immorality. He had to stand up in the midst of a polluted society and proclaim God's truth. And it often takes more courage to stand up against our friends than against our enemies. When he faced the people, he stood alone. Each man, this is important, each man was weak in the sight of men. And if they were not weak enough to begin with, God made them weaker. He reduced their powers so that he might be glorified. And so you see this principle. God can do far more than your weaknesses might ever be considered to provide you. He can do far more than your weaknesses would provide, far more than he can through your strengths. In fact, consider this: the very calamity that may now be striking your life may well be God's method for providing you just what you think that you have lost. Consider Chuck Colson. Remember Charles Colson? He wound up getting far more respect after he went to prison, far more respect having lost everything that had been important to him in his life. He was known as the man who had axed his own mother. And now he is remembered as a man who is beloved by countless thousands of Christians. He accomplished far more to change our society than he ever could have as a counsel to the president. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, thrown into a Russian gulag. How much power do you have in a Russian gulag? None. Total weakness, essentially being a slave. He wrote about his experiences. He is internationally known now and did more than thwart communism, or did more to thwart communism than he could have ever done as a free man within Russia. So, second principle, your trials and weaknesses are the things that make you special. The writer of the Hebrews now mentions people not by name, but by the trials of their lives. But the readers knew immediately who they were. The prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again, and everybody is cheering. These people, by the power of God, were given the ability to overcome in this life. Okay, now we go and we see another verse, the next verse, which paints a little different story. These are witnesses too. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Basically, just ensuring their salvation. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. By the way, it's referring to Isaiah, who the people got upset with him and tired of him. And ultimately, they actually killed him by sawing him in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. Okay, so this tells a very different story. These are people who now, they lost. It just seems like, well, they lost. They lost. What else would you say humanly? They didn't win what they thought they were going to win here on earth. But then you read and say, but that isn't what they were after. They were after their own resurrection. They were after the accolades of God and not the accolades of men. So when you go a little bit farther, what you see is this was mid to late 60s. I think probably 66 or early 67. The times were about to change. So Christianity had been a legal religion. It was about to be very obviously to everyone illegal, something to be avoided, something that could cost you everything, an incredible suffering, because the first persecution was about to start under Nero. This was written during the reign of Nero, who had started his reign as emperor just shortly before, well, a couple of years before this. And it was actually pretty good to the Christians. But from 67 AD to 313 AD, okay, so think about that. You're looking at essentially 2.5 centuries. Christians were persecuted during that whole time. So the age of the religion being legal and accepted by the government was now disappearing, being replaced by 2.5 centuries of persecution. Now, here in America, we're about to celebrate our 250th year in existence as a republic. Okay, that's a long time. So you think back over that period of time. So you think back to Washington, and imagine that from Washington times forward, from the revolution forward, if Christians had been persecuted. That's how people lived. That's how people lived. I don't think it's an accident that it's during those first 3 centuries that the church grew exponentially. And that was the norm, to see the most incredible things happening. And persecution seemed to be right there in the mix. In Iran, you have the fastest growing church in the world. And they're, of course, embracing Christ. means you have chosen to sentence yourself to death, and probably a cruel death, if you're captured, if you're known. Well, 67 AD to 313 AD, Christians hunted down, brutally tortured, killed. These were the days that filled the catacombs with dead bodies. Now, think about the Colosseum. People go to Rome to see the Colosseum. It's incredible, it's imposing, and the rest. Well, the lives of the early Christians were certainly affected by the Colosseum because so many of their loved ones died there, and so many Christians died there. And the lives of the early Christians consisted of persecution above ground and prayer below ground. The catacombs below ground. 600 miles of galleries under Rome, 8 feet high, 3 to 4 feet wide. You see just a little picture of a very small portion. Long rows of carved out recesses like berths on a ship with bodies placed within each. And those berths were enclosed with a single stone slab with inscriptions written on them. And there were designs on each one, epitaphs and symbols. The shepherd holding a lamb was one of the more popular ones. The fish, ichthys, a ship, an anchor, and so on. Well, it turns out dead men do tell tales. When the Christian graves were opened, okay, you find out a lot about how they died. Heads were found severed from their bodies, bones brutally crushed, pulled apart on the rack, bones charred from fire, tales of the worst possible types of torture. And you see the story in their bones. There's a pile of bones to the left because everywhere you see disembodied and disfigured human skulls and piles of bones, human bones. But the epitaphs written on those slabs tell a very different story. Mute reminders of courage and faith. Here lies Marcia, put to rest in a dream of peace. Lawrence, to his sweetest son, born away of angels. Tortured to death, born away of angels. Victorious in peace and in Christ, having apparently lost in the sight of men, but winning in the sight of God. Being called away, he went in peace. And you contrast that to the epitaphs written on the pagan tombs. Live for the present hour, since we are sure of nothing else. I lift my hands against the gods who took me away at the age of 20, though I had done no harm. Once I was not, now I am not. I know nothing about it, and it is no concern of mine. I'm dead. Basically, that's what he's saying. Traveler, another one says, curse me not as you pass, for I am in darkness and cannot answer. Okay, and so it's very powerful. But that persecution of Nero began 10 persecutions. They're often called the 10 primitive persecutions that really didn't end until the early 300s. The first persecution of the church took place in the year 67 under Nero, who was the sixth emperor of Rome. He reigned for the space of 5 years and before starting the persecution, so in 62 AD. And at that time, he actually was a pretty good emperor. But then he just turned his temper and his barbarities and just his whims. On a whim, he ordered that the city of Rome should be set on fire. The order was executed by his officers, his guards, his servants. And while the imperial city was in flames, he went up to the Tower of Maecenas. He played upon his harp, and he sang that, you'll hear he played his violin while Rome burned. It was actually his harp. He sung the song of the burning of Troy, so a military song about the burning of Troy. And he openly declared that, quote, he wished the ruin of all things before his death, unquote. In other words, he was going to die. He knew it. He didn't know when, but he knew he was going to die. And so he wanted everything destroyed if he was going to die. Besides the uh, the pile of rubbish that was building up and burnt remains. Um, the circus was destroyed. Many palaces, houses were consumed. Several thousand people perished in the flames, or were smothered in the smoke, or buried beneath the ruins. So the fire lasted for 9 days. Um, and then Nero realized his conduct was being blamed and that he was concerned about rebellion. And so he decided to lay the whole thing on the Christians and use the Christians as the excuse because the public sentiment was already turning against Christians. And so that gave him the platform he needed to begin um, paying the Christians back for this horrible crime of burning down so much of Rome. Now, some historians say that he burned it because he wanted to rebuild it in his own image, not a statue, but just he wanted to leave his mark on Rome by rebuilding a large section of it. Well, some of the types of things that he did to the Christians, he had them sewed up in skins of wild beasts and then had dogs gathered around them who would attack. Many people died wrapped up just of a heart attack before they were attacked. Um, then there were others that they soaked in sealing wax and then tied them to trees, and they set on fire in his gardens so that he could walk through the gardens with it as bright as day in the evening. Persecution was general throughout all of the Roman Empire, but it had an interesting impact on the growth of Christianity. Christians multiplied. And of course, it was in that persecution of Nero, the first persecution, that both Paul and Peter were martyred. Others were Erastus, who was there in Corinth, Aristarchus, who you read about in the New Testament, the Macedonian, Trophimus, who was an Ephesian you read about, who was converted by Paul and a fellow laborer with him. Joseph, Barnabas, basically, killed in that fire as well. Ananias, who was the bishop of Damascus, not Ananias of Ananias and Sapphira, but different Ananias. But he was one of the 70, as were the others. Then Domitian came in, the second persecution. He was naturally cruel. He was a nasty man. And so the first thing he did after becoming emperor, he murdered his brother. And then he started the second persecution against the Christians not long after. And in his rage, he put to death some of the Roman senators. Some he just didn't like, and others he wanted to confiscate their estates. He then commanded that all the Jews be put to death in the entire empire. There are lots of martyrs under Domitian. John, who you know was on Patmos, actually was first boiled in oil by him. And when he lived, he was banished to Patmos. Then you had Flavia, the daughter of a Roman senator, was banished to Pontus. And they made a law after banishing her, which was no Christian, once brought before the tribunal, should be exempted from punishment without renouncing his religion. They made up lots of stories about Christians. If there was a famine, if there was any pestilence, if there were earthquakes, that was blamed on the Christians. Anywhere in the Roman province, it's the Christians doing it. It's the Christians doing it. Today, isn't it interesting that you can go on social media and you will find the Jews blamed for all types of things. All types of things. And people, even scholars, will stand there and explain to you why the Jews are behind it. Well, it won't be long before they're blaming the Christians. Right now, we're seeing a time where Christianity is being honored, but we know that that's fragile and that we live in a world where um, this is a world that was ruled by Satan. God ultimately wins. But the battle, the spiritual battle for the hearts and minds of men and women continues on. Um, Another thing was that when any Christians were brought before the magistrates, a test oath was proposed when, if they refused to take it, a sentence of death was pronounced against them, usually including a good deal of torture. But if they confessed themselves as Christians, the sentence was the same. If they recanted for many, the sentence was the same. Then you had Nicodemus. Remember Nicodemus? It is said that he died in Domitian's persecution in Rome. Timothy was the bishop of Ephesus, disciple of St. Paul. He zealously governed the church until AD 97. At that time, pagans were about to celebrate a feast called Catagogium, and Timothy met the procession. He severely reproved them for their ridiculous idolatry. So the people got so upset, they began hitting him with clubs and beating him, the crowd. And they essentially beat him to a pulp. So he expired 2 days later. Then you have the third persecution. Now, it's an interesting one. Pliny II, who was a man who was very famous, well-educated, excellent speaker, writer, he saw the slaughter of the Christians. And he was moved by that, to really pity them. And he wrote to Trajan, who was then the emperor, and certified to him that anything contrary to the Roman laws, there was nothing that these Christians were doing that were contrary. Certainly nothing worthy of persecution. And let me read something he said. The whole account they gave of their crime or error, whichever it is to be called, amounted only to this, that they were accustomed on a stated day to meet before daylight and to repeat together a set form of prayer to Christ as a God, and to bind themselves by an obligation, not indeed to commit wickedness, but on the contrary, never to commit theft, robbery, or adultery, never to falsify their word, never to defraud any man, after which it was their custom to separate and reassemble to partake in common of a harmless meal. So that's from Pliny II. Ignatius, some of you may have heard his name. He wrote a good amount and was well respected at that time. Wonderful Christian man. He was appointed to be the bishop of Antioch, and he went from Syria to Rome. And because he was a professor in Christ, was given to the wild beasts to be devoured. And what it was said of him was kind of interesting, that when he passed through Asia, being under the most strict custody of his keepers, he did all he could to strengthen and to encourage the churches through every city he went, and would preach, and in the midst of these persecutions would tell them not to be afraid. And when he came to Smyrna, he wrote to the church at Rome, exhorting them not to use means for his deliverance from martyrdom, lest they should deprive him of that which he most longed and hoped for. Okay, and I'm going to read this, and then think about it in terms of some desired a better resurrection. Here's what he said. Okay, so this is Ignatius. Now I begin to be a disciple. I care for nothing of visible or invisible things, so that I may but win Christ. Let fire and the cross, let the companies of wild beasts, let breaking of bones and tearing of limbs, Let the grinding of the whole body and all the malice of the devil come upon me. Be it so. Only may I win Christ Jesus. That's what he had to say. And even when he was sentenced to be thrown to the beasts, um, he spoke. And when he heard the lions roaring, he said this, I am the wheat of Christ. I am going to be ground with the teeth of wild beasts, that I may be found pure bread. Okay, and so this whole idea that dying well meant not recanting. Okay, that was so embedded in the hearts of people back then. That's the typical prayer was that I might die well. And meaning not, as we might think it today, that I might die at home in bed in my sleep, but rather that I might die in the face of suffering and that my faith in Jesus Christ would be proven beyond all doubt. Okay, can you imagine? 2.5 centuries. That was the way people thought. They wanted to make sure that they died well. Today, we live in a time where fear of ridicule may well be the thing that silences a believer in Christ. But there was a time when the fear of death should have done that, and it didn't. People spoke yet more loudly. There is so much, the cruelties. When you get to Marcus Aurelius, the fourth person, I'm not going to go through all of them this morning, but when you get to Marcus Aurelius, the cruelties used in his persecution were such that people who were watching shuddered with horror. People who were not believers, who thought the Christians deserved this, but they were amazed and astonished at the strong faith of those who suffered. Some of the martyrs had to pass over thorns, nails, sharp shells, and so on, after their feet had already been beaten and they were wounded and bloody. And others were scourged until you could see their sinews and their veins and deep gashes in their body. And after suffering the most excruciating tortures, which I won't describe, they were destroyed in the most horrible way. Sometimes animals, sometimes being torn apart publicly. Torn apart publicly. That's crazy stuff. Evil. Germanicus was a young man, committed Christian, and he was being delivered to the wild beasts because of his faith in Christ. He, before the crowds, acted with such astonishing courage that several pagans became converts to this faith which inspired such fortitude. Polycarp, who was a disciple of John and venerable bishop of Smyrna, when he heard that persons were seeking for him, he escaped. And when he realized they were looking for him, they wanted to, but he was discovered by a child. And after the guards had a big meal, he just asked if he could have an hour in prayer. And he prayed with such fervency that his guards repented that they had been so instrumental in capturing him. Nonetheless, he was carried before the proconsul, he was condemned, and he was burned in the marketplace. And the proconsul had urged him before burning him, swear and I will I will release thee, reproach Christ. And Polycarp answered, interesting. And he said this, 86 years have I served him, and he never once wronged me. How then shall I blaspheme my king, who has saved me? And then at the stake to which he was only tied but not nailed as usual. In other words, the ropes would burn in the flames and people could escape the flames. But he was not nailed. He assured them he would be immovable. He would stay there in the flames on their kindling as they were putting the logs around his body. Um, and the executioner, on seeing this, was ordered to pierce him with a sword as he stood there in the midst of the flames. And what they recount is, and this is in Fox's Book of Martyrs, when such a great quantity of blood flowed out, it extinguished the fire. But his body, at the instigation of the enemies of the gospel, especially the Jews, it's kind of interesting that you had Jews who, in many cases, were egging on the persecution of Christians. Yeah, that wasn't always the case. Um, the in the midst of this, his friends came forward and they wanted to give his body a Christian burial. Um, they collected his bones and as much of his remains as possible, and they buried him with a decent funeral. Uh, I mean, it's crazy. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to stop right there. Well, actually, um, maybe I'll go a little bit further. The lives of the Christians, when you look at the catacombs and then you look at the Colosseum, you realize that Rome and the Roman Empire was a place of death, horrible death for Christians for 2.5 centuries. Now, we live in America, and we know that Christianity has had quite an influence here, a positive influence. We know that there are some who hate Christians and who hate Christianity. There's certainly many today that we see who hate Jews. Um, and yet Christianity grew and grew and grew and grew. And you see these symbols, the Colosseum and the catacombs. The excavations that we call the catacombs, they're temples and tombs. The early Church of Rome might well be called the Church of the Catacombs. There are 60 catacombs near Rome, and the ones near Rome, that's where you have 600 miles, of many more miles than that scattered around Italy. And then you go to France and other places where they have catacombs where Christians were likewise tortured and murdered, in England and so on. The dead bodies are placed there, the front closed, and you have to say, what was it that enabled them to put such positive epitaphs on those slabs of stone placed over the tombs? When the Christian graves were opened and you saw how horrible the persecutions had been, the people then had seen, the people who closed up those tombs had seen the people within the tombs being persecuted. They knew what they looked like before. And yet, despite the awful story of persecutions, the inscriptions breathe forth this peace and joy and triumph. Well, the persecutions now continued on. Severus, Maximus, Decius, Valerian, Aurelian, and then Diocletian. And as you continue on, and Diocletian was particularly bad, it has been said that the lives of the early Christians consist of persecution above ground and prayer below ground. It's an amazing thing to just think about Rome as a place of the death of Christians. People go there today for a holiday. And I mean, and it's a wonderful country. I mean, it's hard to imagine what once was. But the change came because of one man, Constantine. He was used by God. Theologians argue whether or not he was really a Christian. But in 313, you had the Edict of Milan, where you had this declaration of tolerance for Christianity in the Roman Empire. It wasn't until the 320s that he really gained full power. But consider what he did. He convokes the First Council of Nicaea in 325, and that produced the Nicene Creed. It's almost identical to what we would say now is the Apostles' Creed. On his orders, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built at the site claimed to be the tomb of Jesus in Jerusalem. And it was deemed the holiest place in all of Christendom by Constantine. Now, was it really the tomb of Jesus? Again, theologians argue about that. Some say, well, it was Constantine's mother who selected the location, and that as she traveled through Jerusalem, she looked for artifacts, pieces of the cross of Jesus, and so on. There's good reason to think it was. There's good reason to think that it was the Garden Tomb, more recently discovered. That was the place. But whether it was or not, you begin to see that here was a man who did not merely tolerate Christians. He embraced their faith. He granted power to the Bishop of Rome. And there is a document that is ascribed to him, the donation of Constantine, which is used to support the position of the Pope, if you will, the Bishop of Rome as being superior to the other bishops. It's known that it is not an original document. But he's also been historically referred to as the first Christian emperor. And he certainly did favor the Christian church. But there is some debate. In the Eastern Orthodox Rite, he is venerated as a saint. And now, it's interesting about Constantine. It became legal to become a Christian. And then a year or two after his reign started, it became mandatory. And that was when you saw a lot of the statues. The statue of Zeus became effectively the statue of God the Father. And you had various other statues that just suddenly got repurposed, now made Christian. And so, as good as Constantine was, the church afterwards, ultimately it ushered in the Dark Ages. And so it wasn't until the Reformation that you had a rebirth. And what did you have then? Then you began to have martyrs again, Wycliffe being the first major one, just for translating the scriptures into his native tongue.